All right. Again, good morning, everybody. This is Chip Coldren. I am with the CNA Corporation, who is working with BJA, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, on the Smart Policing Initiative. This is a BJA-sponsored webinar on offender call-ins, and I have to say there's been a very strong response to our advertisement for this. So we have quite a large group on the phone today, and I welcome everybody. Most of you probably know what we call offender call-ins are what's often referred to as a lever-pulling strategy. It's becoming very popular for working to reduce criminal activity in targeted offender groups. And there's a very specific way to go about designing and implementing and following up with these call-ins. I've witnessed several of them. And it reminds me very much of a staged production. Usually it's very carefully and intricately planned out. So we have with us today Ed McGarrell, who's the director of the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University. I'll say more about him in a minute, but he's probably one of the people in the country that has the most experience with both implementing these call-ins and actually studying and evaluating them. So I'll come back to that in a minute. I need to just say a few words by means of introduction. This webinar is one in a series of webinars that's sponsored by the Bureau of Justice Assistance related to the Smart Policing Initiative. Vivian Chu, who's on the line, can tell you a little bit about that later, but we have several on our Smart Policing website that are recorded that you can view. You probably know by now that this one is being recorded. It will be made available on the website later on. And we're in the process of developing several more webinars over the next few months. So please look for those announcements and participate as your time and your interest allows. This particular webinar will run probably for about an hour, maybe a little bit longer. We always leave several opportunities for participation by the audience. So please watch for that. Since we have so many people on the line, it's probably not possible to have everybody chime in with a question or a comment. So please note that there's a chat function on the right-hand side of the screen. And if there's a question that you want to lodge or a comment that you want to make, feel free to use that chat function. If we don't get to everybody's questions and comments, we can go back to that when we in the recording and follow up with any questions or any other follow-up actions that seem to be important. Also, after this webinar, sometime later, Ms. Chu will send everybody an evaluation form. Obviously, we encourage you to pay attention to that and to submit it back to us. They've been very helpful in helping us format these webinars, as well as in helping us pick other webinar topics. So you will have an option on that form to suggest any other topics, or in this case, we know that Ed has a ton of experience and a ton of material that he could present, and it might be a good idea to have a follow-up webinar after this one. So please keep that in mind as well. Let's go back to Ed. I know Ed's waiting in the wings to get started here. I've known Ed for many, many years, and he was instrumental in Indianapolis in implementing a series of these call-ins with offenders that were very fascinating. I think he would say that they were very helpful to the crime reduction work they were doing in Indianapolis at the time. I also know that he studied them and he evaluated them and he spoke with the offenders who took part in them, and so he has a lot of information and experience in terms of what to expect from these realistically. So Ed, I'm going to turn it over to you now. I thank you very much for the time you put into this and for your interest in working with us on this webinar. So please go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you, Chip. Good morning to everyone. I appreciate this opportunity. As Chip mentioned, I've been working with different communities for probably about 15 years now that have used the call-in meetings as part of the strategy. So it's a nice opportunity to be able to kind of pull that experience together. There's quite a bit of material that I'd like to cover. and I've broken it into 5 sections, as you can see here. I'm going to try to move through the first 2 parts really quickly, just kind of background material. But I think the issue here is to get you thinking about where these call-in meetings fit within your overall strategy. It's not an off-the-shelf kind of technology that you just do for the sake of doing, but it really should be driven by the crime problem and the crime analysis that you're doing in your local jurisdiction. So in between each of these sections, we'll take some Q&A. Because of the amount of material and the number of participants, I think that it's probably likely that you're going to pose questions that I'm going to get to in later sections of the presentation. So if I say, well, let's hold that question, I'm not trying to ignore you, and I think Chip and Vivian will help collect those questions because we want to make sure that we get through those. So let's just jump right into this. I think as many of you know, the first use of these call-in meetings occurred as part of Boston Ceasefire, which was an effort focused on youth gun violence in the mid-1990s. And what they found in their problem analysis was that it was really a small group of young people in Boston. They estimated about 1 to 3% of the youth population that were really driving the youth gun violence issues. So the meetings arose as a way of trying to directly communicate to that small and highly focused population. So how do we communicate to those individuals most at risk of being involved, in this case, in youth gun violence? They didn't use this terminology of A and B listers at the time, but this has kind of grown up over the last decade as different communities have used this. And to kind of simplify the situation, I think this will make more sense as we move through this. The idea would be, as people are prosecuted and incarcerated in the criminal justice system, can we use that experience as a way of trying to influence others? In this case, how do we influence the B-listers, those individuals who are at risk of becoming involved in this criminal behavior, through the example of those who unfortunately need to be incarcerated and removed from the community? The power of these meetings come out of this direct communication to those individuals most at risk. The additional ideas behind the call-in meeting is this deterrent message is coupled with 2 other critical components. One is the community, and the community expressing their voice, as well as an offer of social support. The community role often is one of community members expressing their exasperation of having to live in fear, not being able to have their kids use the park, not being comfortable walking to the corner store, and expressing those concerns, and oftentimes coupled with their exasperation with the fact that so many young people from the community are either being incarcerated or unfortunately are ending up as the victims of homicide and other serious crimes. Those messages become combined with this offer of social support. So it's deterrence, it's the community voice, and it's this offer of social support. Many of you probably know the experience that Boston had in ceasefire. They had this dramatic decline in youth homicides following that. That led to the Department of Justice encouraging sites through a couple major initiatives, the Strategic Approaches to Community Safety Initiative, also known as SACSI, as well as Project Safe Neighborhoods. You'll hear me refer to that as PSN. I'm assuming there's people on the line who are part of both of those initiatives. And through those initiatives, the use of the call-in meeting has been expanded beyond youth violence to addressing a variety of crime problems. I take this graph from our work in Indianapolis, and I think the important thing here is maybe 2 messages. One is, after implementing the program, we saw dramatic reductions in homicide, similar to that experienced in Boston. But I really want to point you to this last part of the chart here. This is the reduction in the victimization level of young men in 5 hotspot areas. And it was in those 5 hotspot areas that these call-in meetings were used. and you see this dramatic reduction. So here it is, identifying those we believe most at risk of being involved in serious gun crime, communicating this message, and seeing this significant reduction. And it's that kind of reduction that we hope will happen in all the smart policing sites. Since that time, there have been a number of evaluations that have come out. This approach has been used in a much bigger population of communities, but we have clear evaluation results from a number of these sites that suggest that the Boston and Indianapolis findings weren't aberrations, but indeed we can have this kind of impact. So then the issue becomes, why do they seem to have an impact? And we think it's these reasons. The first is that we really are talking about an at-risk population, so identifying that at-risk population becomes critical. Then we reduce the anonymity of those individuals in that at-risk population, and we deliver a very focused and specific message to those that need to hear it. The call-in meeting also takes advantage of the fact that these individuals operate within broader social networks. And so what we want to see happen is these individuals that might come into a meeting, we want them to go out and communicate to others in their social network and thereby expand the influence beyond those attending the meeting. Additional reasons that we think these call-in meetings have the power that they seem to do is that they're perceived as fair. And we know that people are more likely to comply with the law to the extent that they perceive it as fair and legitimate. And then again, this issue of community support. So we think that when you combine the deterrent message with this offer of social support and the voice of the community, that we move towards this increased legitimacy in the whole process. And we end up with a balanced approach that includes this focused deterrent message with this offer of social support and then the strong voice of the community. The offender notification, so I'll use terms like offender notification meeting, call-in meeting, forums, and I'm really using those terms interchangeably. But we think that the call-in meetings can be thought of as part theater, part threat, and part offer of social support. So let me quickly see if there's any immediate questions on kind of this overall background on these meetings. Okay, I'm sure there are questions out there, so put them in the chat message box and we'll gather those. And again, I think a lot of the specific questions are going to come up as we work through the rest of the session. Yes. Good. Okay, let's move forward. The other kind of critical thing that I want to emphasize here is thinking about how the call-in meetings fits with your strategic plan and your strategic problem-solving process. And what we've seen, as I mentioned earlier, is these meetings have expanded beyond the use of trying to influence groups and gangs and a particular focus on gun carrying and Project Safe Neighborhoods, to now they've been used to address the issue of drug markets, they've been used in inmate entry initiatives, and some additional emerging applications that I'll talk about. And I think that, the critical point, again, is how does this fit within your problem analysis, the specific problem you're focusing on, and the analysis that is guiding your efforts. So I'll come back again to the issue of gun crime analysis. And here we try to look at all kinds of sources of information to try to understand what's driving gun crime in our particular jurisdiction. In the case of Boston, in the case of Indianapolis, initially in High Point, some of the places where they found that it was gangs and groups that were driving their gun violence, and the call-in meetings seemed to make sense for that particular problem. Here's an example from Cincinnati, Ohio. They began trying to understand what was driving their homicide and their gun violence. They ended up with this large group of what they refer to as violent street groups that were active in Indianapolis. Cincinnati, I'm sorry. Here's one particular group that's referred to as the Taliban. This is a fairly large street group, about 118 members in that are involved in violence. In the next step of their approach, they identified what they considered kind of the top 25 key players within this initiative. And when they started getting this kind of picture of this particular group, the call-in meeting started to make sense. And the issue was, as we start prosecuting some of these key players and doing the things that the criminal justice system does well, how do we use that example to influence this broad network? And the call-in meeting became their approach to doing that. So in this example of the violent group, what we're trying to do is, again, when we're prosecuting the most violent, those with the longest histories, we want to use that example to then influence this broader network. And in doing so, we want to prevent that backfilling that often occurs. So you've had a major crackdown of a group. It has an immediate impact, but I'm sure many of the people on this call have had that experience within another 30 days, 60 days, or 90 days, another group has become involved in the same kind of activity. The call-in meeting can also be powerful in trying to address the problem of retaliatory violence. So maybe you have feuding groups, and you're fearful that one group is going to exact retaliation against another. The call-in can quickly put people on notice. The call-in can also be an effective way of reminding felons of the prohibition of their carrying guns and trying to reduce the level of gun carrying by those high-risk populations. And so ultimately what we're trying to do is reduce that anonymity, disrupt this network in creating alternative pressures on a group like the Taliban. Now, after High Point had some success with the call-in meetings reducing levels of gang violence, they started, again, looking at what was driving violence in their community, and they came to the conclusion that the next problem they had to focus on were these drug markets. And so they said, can we use the call-in meeting as a way of trying to influence these overt drug markets operating in specific parts of the city? So they modified the call-in in a couple key ways. And first of all, they, again, try to use intelligence to identify all the players that they believed were involved in the market. They then conducted a very traditional undercover operation with confidential informants and undercover officers making buys. At that point, they started to distinguish between the A-listers and the B-listers. And the A-listers were those with long histories long criminal histories and involvement in violence, where everyone in the room said, unfortunately, these guys got to be removed from the community. They were prosecuted as would normally happen. But then what they wanted to do was to have this influence on these B-listers, those nonviolent, less serious, oftentimes the hand-to-hand dealer, maybe they're the lookouts in this network, but who haven't reached that level. They may still be redeemable. And the difference in the drug market approach is that they actually hold those drug cases over the heads of these B-listers. They come into the meeting, they learn about the charges over them, they're told that the drug market stops today, and if you continue, we will implement or execute these charges. There have been a large number of communities that have now taken this approach with the drug market. There have been evaluations done in High Point, Providence, and Nashville that have indicated real promise with this approach, so the findings to date have been quite promising. Some additional extensions of the call-in approach. Chicago, in particular, has used the call-in as what they refer to as parolee forums. So every month in some targeted Project Safe Neighborhoods areas, parolees are being invited into these meetings. And the preliminary results from that research, again, very promising. High Point has used the call-in meetings to deal with the problem of street robberies. And they're now getting ready to use the call-in as part of an overall approach to domestic violence. A couple of communities have even used this to address landlord issues with some problem properties. I was recently in Roanoke, Virginia, where they're taking this approach. And in their target neighborhood, they went through with code enforcement officers, identified all that they considered problem properties, and then brought the landlords into a call-in meeting. And in fact, provided an educational message backed up by this promise that if they don't address the problems, enforcement will follow. So again, I want to come back to this idea of thinking of the call-in meetings as part of your strategic planning process, thinking about the specific problem you're dealing with. Can we identify some at-risk candidates who would be appropriate to bring into one of these meetings? How do we involve the community and then actually carry out the call-in meeting? Once again, are there any immediate questions? I want to move to really talking about the logistics of the meeting and the actual meeting itself. But if there's any questions on the background, on these background matters, happy to take them now. Okay, you're making me feel just like a college professor with a big classroom of students who aren't talking, but I trust that you've bought into the idea we're going to address your questions as we keep moving. So please write them down, put them in the chat box, chat block, and we'll make sure that we address these questions. So now I do want to talk about the logistics. Okay, you've been convinced. Your problem analysis suggests, yeah, I think the call-in meeting is a good idea. What needs to happen? And there's a number of concrete steps that you're going to need to put in place if you're going to make this call-in meeting occur and have the impact that you hope to. Among the steps that need to occur, obviously you need to identify who are our call-in candidates. Who do we want to have in this meeting? Then we need to extend an invitation, or that may be a nice way of saying we're going to order these people to attend this meeting. Then we need to be thinking about the influentials, people that may have an influence in the lives of these B-listers that are going to come into the meeting. We also need to be thinking about how we're going to engage the community and enlist their participation. We need to think about where are we going to hold this meeting, what kind of place, where should this occur, and then what is the actual message and who's going to deliver it. So in this next segment, these are all the topics that we want to address. I'll come back to this example of the Taliban. If you're dealing with a group-based situation of offending, then the question becomes, how do we get intelligence on all these individuals involved in this network and think about who might be appropriate to bring in? A common approach with a network like the Taliban is to identify, well, who's on probation and parole? I guarantee you, without knowing the Cincinnati situation, out of 118 people in a group like the Taliban, there are a number of people on probation and parole. There are a number that probably have outstanding warrants. Those all become sources of leverage to bring these people into the meeting. So the key point here in identifying our call-in candidates, again, I go back to that problem analysis. What problem are you dealing with? Who is at risk? Who's at high risk of being involved in this? Using all kinds of sources of criminal intelligence that you have and street-level intelligence. And I think Chip would back me up. The experience that we've had with street-level officers, working those particular neighborhoods with members of the gang unit, the narcotics unit, probation parole officers oftentimes have a wealth of intelligence on these individuals. And then we're going to employ those levers. So we may use the probation or parole to order the individuals to attend the meeting. We may have lower level outstanding warrants that can be used to pull these people in. Or in the case of the drug market, as an example, we may actually go out and build cases, some of whom may be prosecuted as part of that A-list, some of whom we may hold those cases over them. We next need to begin to think about what are the criteria for who's going to be on the A list and who's going to be on the B list. And then I would recommend what we've come to refer to as a systematic case review, where a team in your local site will actually go through all these candidates and decide, is this someone appropriate to bring into our call-in meeting? So let's talk a little bit about the criteria. I don't think there's any kind of firm answer. I think each site works this out for themselves. Typically what you tend to see is that distinction between the A list, again, those individuals who are going to be prosecuted, and the B list, those who are appropriate to bring into this call-in meeting, has to do with elements like their prior history in violence and the extensiveness of their record. What we usually see happen is when you actually sit down, as a team and begin to look at these individuals, there's oftentimes an A list that's very clear. Everyone in the room says, sorry, this person's just too far down the line. Given their propensity toward violence, they need to be removed from the community. And there's also usually a very clear B list. People, we're comfortable. This guy just seems to be getting involved in the game, doesn't have a long history, have no reason to believe that they're involved in violence. They're somebody who's likely a candidate for the call-in meeting. And then usually there's a middle category that's a little tougher call. And those are where you're going to need to figure out, is this somebody that we feel like we can take a chance on and bring into a call-in meeting, or is this someone who's reached that stage where they need to be prosecuted? And I would emphasize, I think the process becomes very important here in finding a process that your team is comfortable with in making these kind of decisions. At this point, I mentioned the systematic case review, and there have been different approaches in different communities. So I'll use Roanoke as another example. There, the prosecutor said, we always rely on the police to bring us these cases, and I'm comfortable with the police, in effect, making a decision in terms of who they're going to recommend for prosecution and who they're going to bring into the call-in meeting. And so having kind of these general criteria, that a history of violence or a truly chronic record of offending, that they're going to bring those to the prosecutor for prosecution, but otherwise the police can decide on who's appropriate for this call-in meeting. In a number of places, the police and prosecutors will sit down and do this together. This was done very effectively in Seattle, where they also involved community prosecutors who had great knowledge of what was happening in that particular neighborhood context. But the police and prosecutors sat down and on a case-by-case basis made this determination: A list, B list, or here's somebody we really need to talk about. In some places, probation and parole is included in this decision-making process, and I think that can be a very valuable tool. They're able to talk about many of their current clients, and maybe they have some information that's valuable in making this determination. Somebody's technically been violating. They're showing up on drug, is drug positive, and so maybe they're appropriate, maybe they're not appropriate for the call-in meeting. And in some places, they've even gone so far, and High Point would be an example of this, where they've been doing this for a dozen years. They have some key community partners that are highly trusted, and they're actually part of this decision-making process. And they bring that community voice and may know something, about these individuals that may be pertinent to inviting them into the call-in meeting or deciding that they're not appropriate for the call-in meeting. So again, I think that the process here is clear, and I think you can think about why this is important. One of the biggest concerns that we hear in different sites is, what if one of these guys at a call-in meeting goes off and does something horrible? And certainly that's always a risk. We're not aware of this happening in any of the many sites that have used the call-in meetings, but clearly it is a possibility. And so by having agreed upon criteria and having a process that includes the prosecutor and police and maybe other partners helps create that shared responsibility. It also helps create some accountability, and that we're going to hold ourselves accountable for following through on the message that's delivered in this meeting. And all of that can go into creating this buy-in among your team participants. And next, so let's say we've gone through that process and we've identified a group of these B-listers that we think are appropriate for bringing into the meeting. The question then becomes, well, how are we going to get them to attend this meeting? And so, I list this here. You can think about this as an invitation. You might think about this as an order. Again, a common approach is for probationers and parolees. They may be ordered in as part of the condition of their probation or parole status. and so their PO may inform them that you will attend this meeting, similar to their requirement to report to their probation or parole officer. In the case of the drug market, I mentioned earlier, they actually went out and built cases on these individuals, and they used the threat of prosecution as a way of getting them in, and that approach could be extended to others. In the case of the landlords, it was a simple invitation. We'd like you to attend this meeting. A common kind of approach in many of these communities is that they actually deliver a letter of invitation. It may come from the chief, it may be the chief and the prosecutor, and maybe even the U.S. attorney in some places will co-sign this letter. The example in front of you here comes from High Point, and this comes from a meeting related to drug selling in a particular drug market operation. But you can see how this could easily be adapted for other kind of crime problems. And some of the key points here are the ones that are underlined. That we're not trying to trick you. You're not going to be arrested at this meeting, unless you do something inappropriate on your way in or during the meeting. But this is, this conveys the seriousness with which the folks in the criminal justice system take this meeting, and we want you to be there. Interestingly, High Point, their community partners deliver a parallel meeting, and this would typically go to a family member or other influential connected to that B-lister. It explains what the meeting is about. It explains that the community is working with law enforcement on this initiative, and we think it's really important that, in this case, your son or your daughter or this friend of yours is in some trouble, and we think it's very important that they come to this meeting. And this answers a lot of those questions. One of the things that we found is that it's much more effective to hand deliver these letters face-to-face than it is simply to stick them in the mail. And part of this is just plain logistics, and oftentimes these guys have given bad addresses to their probation or parole officer, or they're moving around and they're transient. And it also conveys the seriousness with which these meetings are held. I was blown away in that visit to Roanoke. The chief of police is actually going to hand deliver these letters to their call-in candidates. Another critical component of the call-in meeting is to think about the role of influentials. And by influentials, we mean, those people most important in the life of this B-lister who's going to be invited into the meeting. We'd like them both to encourage the person to attend the meeting and to attend the meeting along with the call-in candidate. So here you really think about this informal social network around these B-listers. It may be a parent, it may be a grandparent, it may be a sports coach, some other person. But the importance here is we want that moral voice of someone most important to the B-lister. And we also hope that as an outcome of this meeting, that those same influentials may exert some informal surveillance and support after the meeting. In one of the meetings I was observing, the mom was standing behind her son, who was one of the call-in attendees. And at one point, she just kind of slapped him across the head and said, "I had no idea you were involved in this stuff. And believe you me, you are not going to be out of this house in the evening for, I don't know what she said, for the next year or something." But, that kind of parental surveillance is one of the positive outcomes that may come from this meeting. So then, if you've bought into this idea that we want these influentials, then the question becomes, how do we identify them? And in effect, the places that have done this well have used all kinds of sources of information. Again, in the Roanoke example, they were in the middle of this process during my visit, and they were using intelligence databases that were giving them different addresses and names of parents and brothers and sisters. They were reaching out into the community to try to get that kind of community level knowledge. They went back to their school resource officers and said, you know, when Joe Blow was attending the local high school, you know, was there a teacher, was there a coach, was there somebody important in their life? And some places have even used jail and prison visitation records to identify potential influentials. Assuming we've identified those influentials, then the same kind of invitation is extended to them. And one of the things that we've seen that's been very effective has been when a team goes out to make these invitations. So it may be somebody from the police department, maybe somebody from the faith community, another community leader, who go out jointly and make this face-to-face visit with both the B-lister, or the person that's specifically being invited into the meeting, as well as their influential. And when that face-to-face visit and invitation occurs, we see very high rates of participation and attendance in the meetings. Another key component, along with the influentials, is to think about the role of the community. And how do we get the community engaged to be partners with us in this overall strategy and with the call-in meeting in particular? This is varied from place to place. In some jurisdictions, it's really community representatives, so several key community leaders who are part of the meeting. In other places, it's been a much bigger meeting and a broader invitation to the community is extended to have them come in and be part of this meeting. This, I think there are a number of benefits to this community engagement component. One of which is it's an opportunity for the police and prosecutors and other criminal justice partners, to show the community that we are concerned with the violence problem, the drug problem, whatever crime problem it is that you're concerned about in your particular SPI site. But also to demonstrate the fairness of the message. We're warning these people. These people are at risk. We don't want them to go down this line. They're being warned, and they're also being offered this support. There's something fundamentally fair that strikes people that attend these meetings. We're also hoping to enlist the community as co-producers. We're hoping that after this meeting, those community members, if they see criminal activity, that they're more likely to report it. That they're more likely to be victims. I'm sorry, you don't want them to be more likely to be victims. That they're more likely to be cooperating witnesses somewhere down the line. And all those roles that we hope occur within a healthy community, that will be another outcome. And then in terms of the power of the meeting itself, we want to enlist that community moral voice to be part of this message. Communities have taken different approaches to this. Again, sometimes it's working, with those established community groups within a particular neighborhood. Some places they actually of community forums or town halls. And Flint, Michigan, I think, just had great success. You probably are aware that Flint unfortunately shows up right at the top of the list in terms of their homicide rate. They had tremendous community participation, and they did a series of 3 town halls before the call-in meeting where they provided general information about what they were trying to do, and were able to enlist great community support in their initial call-in meeting. I think it's important if you're going to do this while you're doing this community engagement, to work closely with your law enforcement partners. You don't want, if there is an undercover operation occurring at the time, you don't want anything to occur that would compromise that investigation or create any kind of officer safety issues. Another logistical question is figuring out, well, where are we going to hold this meeting? So thinking about, what are our options? again, I don't think there's any kind of magical answer to this. And the most common places we've seen, have been criminal justice settings like a police department or in the court. But other jurisdictions have said, no, we want to do this within the community. A community center, a library, a school, a church. All of these various settings have been used very productively. And I think this, again, your team can have this discussion and figure out what's best for your community. I think those who like holding this in the police department or the court, like the symbolism of this is an official criminal justice function. This is very serious, and we mean, that this deterrent message has some teeth behind it. And I think in contrast, there's great symbolism of holding this within the community. And that this is all part of an effort to reduce crime and violence within this particular neighborhood, and so it's appropriate that we hold this within this community setting. And again, I don't think the outcome of the meeting is determined by the specific setting. You just need to determine what's best in your particular community. A parallel question then becomes, well, how big a site how big a venue do we need? So again, I'll go back to the example with Flint. They anticipated having anywhere from 100 to, well, actually they weren't sure since this was the first one. They said we might have 20 people, but we could have 150 people show up. So they planned for the 150, and they just about got that level. So this was in a gymnasium in local community. Part of this is just figuring out, well, who's going to be in attendance. And so you can begin with those B-listers. Usually in most communities, this has tended to range at the small end for maybe a half a dozen of these B-list attendees to the more typical might be somewhere in the teens, in the low to mid-20s. Dallas, Texas is a real exception, and I wouldn't recommend beginning at this point, but they do monthly probation and parole forums where they'll have 400 or 500 people in attendance, probationers and parolees, and so they need a very large venue. But typically you're probably talking somewhere between 6 and 30 of these B-list candidates. Then you're going to have your criminal justice officials. And I think one of the powerful symbolic messages here is to have this show of force of local, state, and federal law enforcement, prosecutors, probation and parole, all standing together as part of this meeting and demonstrating their cooperation and commitment to holding faithful to this message. You're also going to have your social service providers. Members of the faith community, the support community that are there to offer their assistance to these B-listers. You're going to have the influentials. So ideally, you'd have at least one of these for every B-list attendee. Sometimes they'll bring other members of the family. It's not uncommon to see a mother bring the siblings along to this meeting. And then again, you're going to have this question of, well, how extensive involvement do we want from the community? What do we anticipate? And again, this may be a small group of community representatives, or it may be open to the community at large. And those are the kind of considerations that you'll need to give in thinking about the size of the venue where you'll want to hold your call-in meeting. And then the next kind of logistical question is to think about the message itself. Who will deliver it, and what does this message consist of? And at a broad level, there are three kind of key components of this message. There's a law enforcement criminal justice message, the community message, and the social service message. From law enforcement, typically this is what you're going to hear. The crime problem, whatever it is you're dealing with, so the violence must stop. It ends tonight. We're tired of it. The things that you've been involved with, the people that you hang with and associate with, we believe, put you at high risk for either being the victim or an offender. And we don't want either of those to occur. That's why you've been called into this meeting. And then there are usually examples given of people who did not listen. So those A-listers who've been prosecuted. Unfortunately, this often includes posters of people who've been killed, who've been homicide victims, who look very similar to these B-listers. In the Indianapolis example, there were tragic examples of people who had once been on the B list who had later become homicide victims, and they became powerful examples. Oftentimes, this is done with posters that are displayed. Some communities run a PowerPoint presentation that will show, in effect, typically mugshots. And these are oftentimes people that these listers know, again, who've been victimized or who are now been incarcerated, and that's communicating the seriousness of the risk that these individuals face. Then the message continues, if this violence, if the drug dealing, if you fail to respond to these problems in your property, then we're going to do everything in our power to arrest and prosecute you. Again, a powerful component of this is this notion of, you're on a list. We may not be, you've been through the system before. We may not be able to fix all the problems in the system that exist, but you're part of a group of 20. And all of us here together can respond to anything that you become involved with. This is a credible deterrent message that we're communicating. And an additional component, if you're dealing with gangs or street crews or groups, there's also oftentimes this message of, we're holding you accountable for anything that other members of your group do. In effect, a group accountability message. So that, if next weekend somebody from your group's involved in a shooting, we're not just going after that individual, but we're going after all of you who are involved in this group. From the community, the message typically consists of these kind of messages. First of all, we're tired of the violence. We're tired of, again, our kids aren't able to use the park. Our elderly residents don't even feel comfortable walking out to their mailbox, or I can't walk down the street to the store. We're also tired of seeing the young men in this community, either being locked up or being the victim of this violence, and it has to stop. And the shootings, the drug dealing, whatever it is that your team is focused on, this stuff is just wrong. However, having said that, we value each and every one of you, and we want you to be a positive part of this community, and we're also there to help you in whatever way we can. However, if you choose not to listen, if you don't take advantage of the messages being communicated here, if you don't make the right choice, we also want you to know that we're here backing up the police and prosecutors, and if they need to remove you from the community, then we're in support of that. The third part of the message is the social services message. It's similar to that community message, that we too are hoping that you'll choose to go forward in a positive manner. We're here to work with you. We'll offer you support in as many ways as we can. And we'd like you to meet with us and find out about the services that are available and how we might be able to help you. In an ideal situation, you may have a services coordinator or case manager. Some of the folks may probably remember meeting Linda Wright from Lansing, a retired Lansing police officer. She serves the service coordinator role in the Lansing effort. That's ideal. Sometimes it's a probation or parole officer who will serve in this function, or if there's a one-stop service provider in your community, they may become valuable partners in this. The meetings can occur in the early Indianapolis examples. We didn't have anybody that played that role. We had direct service providers who were there and willing to meet with these clients. So this is another issue that you'll need to think through. How do we try to connect these B-listers to these services? But having this message as part of the call-in meeting is another key component. I want to talk a little bit about some of the lessons learned with these meetings, and I think, and this relates to this message that's being delivered. It becomes absolutely critical to be credible on both sides of this equation, both in terms of the deterrent threat as well as in the offer of support. You want to make sure that if you've said the violence stops here, and if you're a member of the Taliban and somebody goes out and commits a homicide this weekend that we believe is part of the Taliban, you better be, as a team, better be ready to respond to that full network in as many ways as possible. And that's where this concept of pulling levers comes in. But we want to be credible. I remember an example from Indianapolis where the prosecutor said, you walk out of here, anything you do, we're going to prosecute you. You spit on the sidewalk. That message instantly lost credibility because everyone in the room knew you weren't going to get prosecuted for spitting on the sidewalk. So think about what you're saying and be credible. And it's the same set of issues on the offer of support. You don't want to promise something that you can't deliver. Another key message is to be respectful. I'm sure everyone on this call knows that among the population that you're inviting into this call-in meeting, there's nothing more important to them than respect. And so you want to make sure this message is credible, it's serious, it's delivered in a serious fashion, but it needs to be done in a way that's also communicated in a very respectful manner. There'll be multiple voices delivering this message, and I think that's oftentimes powerful. And there'll be some balance between doing this in a reasonable amount of time and not becoming a long set of testimonials, but having multiple voices that reinforce this message. So typically, from law enforcement, it's typically some combination of maybe the police chief or deputy chief responsible for that particular area within your city. It may be the prosecutor. It may be the U.S. attorney. Sometimes probation or parole are part of this. But typically, you'd have some representation from those organizations. A neighborhood leader is often powerful. Crime victims can be particularly powerful speakers. Another important voice, and again, your particular SPI site will have to figure out your comfort level with this, but in our interviews with offenders, one of the things that we discovered was, we asked, well, who do you listen to? And the person that they talked about was, somebody that used to be in the game who's turned their life around. So oftentimes there have been some ex-gang members, ex-offenders, who you feel comfortable with, that you can trust, and they can be a powerful voice in these meetings. And then, again, somebody from social services. Usually the meeting is not long enough to have every possible social service provider speak, but you want one person delivering that message with then the opportunity for the attendees to learn more about these services afterwards. It becomes absolutely critical to prepare the speakers. Where these meetings have tended to go astray, it's when some speaker comes in, they don't know what the message is, they don't really understand what this is all about, and they just kind of go off on some tangent. So one recommendation, and I'll come back to this later, is the idea of actually using a script that may just be bullet points, but that can reinforce the message that's being delivered here. Another related issue to this is, well, what's the order of presentations, and how are we going to set up this meeting? And there have been several different approaches that have been used effectively in different communities. Here's, I think, probably the most common is where this is one meeting where law enforcement, community, and social services all deliver a message to the same audience. Usually there's somebody from law enforcement who moderates this and introduces the speaker and then wraps it up. This is the format that Indianapolis used, and I think most communities have followed this. But there have been some variations, and High Point began with that one meeting approach, but they've now evolved where they actually do 2 meetings. They begin with a law enforcement only meeting.
I don't know.
And so this is where the police and prosecutors deliver their message. Then they actually break into a separate meeting that's run by community and social services. And so they kind of physically move to another room where community and social service providers deliver their message. A third variation on this is kind of the number 2 but in reverse, and this is where there's a broader community meeting to begin with. It may be the example that I just observed was in Flint, Michigan. Here the chief of police moderated that. He gave a message, introduced some members of the community. There were some parents of homicide victims who spoke, some social service providers spoke, and this was a general message to the full community, with the B-listers and their influentials sitting and hearing this message but not identified as B-listers. They then broke into a smaller meeting that only involved the B-listers, the influentials, and then the law enforcement partners, and this is where the specific deterrent message was delivered to these individuals. I don't think there's any clear answer to which format you want to use. I encourage your teams to go back and talk about this as a team and figure out what makes the most sense for you. I think you probably have the same things going on in your mind that come to my mind. I think the advantage of that first type, the single common meeting, is that everyone hears the same message. There's no mystery. Your community partners, social service, law enforcement, everybody's on the same page, have heard the same thing. The advantage of that second meeting, the High Point model that's emerged, they feel like there's an opportunity for this very severe and stringent and credible deterrent message to be delivered initially, but then to move kind of symbolically into the separate community meeting where this offer of support will occur. And they feel kind of that 2-step process for them is a nice way of delivering that message. The third type, the reason Flint did this, they were concerned with some peculiar Michigan laws, and Flint so far is the only place that's kind of interpreted this way, but they did not want to disclose the identity of these B-listers to the broader community. And so they did these meetings separately so that they could have a very concrete discussion with the B-listers, and these were individuals where they actually had cases that they were holding over their heads. And so they wanted to disclose that information in a law enforcement only meeting with only the B-listers and their influentials. So again, just some things to consider. Where problems have arisen, again, it's the speaker that doesn't really understand why they're there. There was an awful one of these that occurred in Chicago, and I happened to be visiting, and the poor Chicago partners I know were horrified as this community member went off, and I would describe it as kind of a 1960s radical message condemning the police who were holding this meeting. So that was a little tricky. Time issues become a consideration. Here at the university, we tell our faculty you got about 10 minutes per segment before you're going to lose the interest of your students. And if our students can only maintain their attention for 10 minutes, just think about these folks who probably dropped out of school at an earlier date. So you need to be attentive to the time. These shouldn't be long and drawn out. Ideally, they're less than an hour. And in order to address these first two issues, we would encourage you to consider the use of a script. Seattle did this in their approach, and we have a very detailed script that we'd be happy, from Seattle, we'd be happy to share with you. It happens to be one where they were dealing with the drug market issue, but I think you could use that and modify that to deal with whatever kind of crime problem that you're specifically addressing. So any questions on all these logistics?
Ed, no. Two questions came in, Ed. This is Iris Gonzalez. We have a question from Jim Gilmer. who wanted to know about programmatic fatigue factor, because he's noticed that at some sites the initiatives tend to disintegrate after a while. So he wanted to know about the programmatic fatigue factor as well as organizational costs, real and intangible. The second question is from Michael Zachary, and he said, was there any backlash from what some offenders might consider a dare? So programmatic fatigue and backlash from what offenders might consider a dare.
Those are two great questions. The fatigue question is actually one that I'm struggling with from both kind of a theoretical and practical standpoint. From a theoretical standpoint, I think the question is, do these have kind of sustained impact over time? And I think the evidence, the honest answer to that is we're still finding out. The most positive evidence on that, well, okay, let me jump to the second part. Then I think the issue is the ability of the organizations and the multiple organizations to sustain this over time. I did feel like this became an issue within Indianapolis. And one of the things that we felt was happening is we were moving away from a strategic focus to starting doing these meetings on kind of a routine basis, and we weren't quite thinking about, well, what's the problem on the streets right now, and who needs to be in this meeting to address that problem. And we started to kind of use a routine approach of just pulling in a group of probationers and parolees. And I think that was another part of this kind of organizational fatigue that I offer as kind of just a heads up to be alert to. The best evidence of this, I think, comes from, and I'd offer High Point as an example, and maybe Chicago at another extreme, where because they've tracked the impact of this, and I also want to come back to some pointers that I think can help address this question, but because they've carefully monitored the impact, and they built this strong community engagement, they feel like they've created a momentum where they couldn't do business in a different way at this point. The community would not allow them to walk away from that. So I think thinking about that question as you go through this and having it as part of your deliberations of how do we maintain momentum, how do we continue to do this in a strategic way, become critical ways of addressing that question. And then while I say that the research doesn't clearly answer the question about the long-term sustained impact, I think the researcher in me says we still need to know more about this. One of the things to guard against would be oftentimes this is done in the spirit of, or in the situation or context of a crisis situation. So youth homicide in Boston, record-setting levels of homicide in Indianapolis. And when the impact occurred, there was a tendency to kind of move on to other problems. And so I think guarding against that, that's something High Point's been able to do. And then in the Chicago example, where they've tracked the impact at both the community level and on the people attending these meetings, they're seeing such success that that's creating its own environment. So I go back to that overall kind of problem-solving process where after you've implemented and done these meetings and had your after-action deliberation of what went well, what didn't go well, then think about that ongoing assessment, and I think that's the best way to create momentum. In terms of organizational costs, usually this has been done, and this relates to the fatigue factor. In most of the sites, this has been done as an add-on to everyone else's responsibilities, and that becomes difficult. I think where funding has been available and has been useful is you oftentimes spend for that service coordinator who's actually going to work with these B-listers. That's an ideal situation, but the reality is oftentimes that hasn't been available, and jurisdictions have still had success with this. In terms of the backlash, the most concrete example of this actually occurred in Chicago, where there was a meeting with some of the gang leaders, and afterwards they became very confrontational. And I think there were two, and I don't have direct information on this, so this is secondhand, but what I've been told is there were two problems that emerged in that situation. One is that there was some question of how respectful the message was delivered. But the second was they kind of lost sight of who this was being delivered to. These were kind of the major organized gangs within Chicago and some of the longtime leaders, people who probably belonged on the A-list, who were at this meeting, as opposed to those lower-level players that needed to hear this message. And I think I go back to this point about delivering the message in a firm but respectful way seems to be the best way to avoid that backlash that might occur from meeting attendees. And let me, on both these points, I think I have some other comments that I want to offer that I think also get to these specific questions. So let me move to those, and again, I want to leave time at the end for additional questions. So you've done the meeting, and as Chip mentioned in his introduction, these are part theater. There's a lot of work that goes into them. There's kind of a natural tendency to take a breath afterwards and almost feel like, okay, we've taken care of this. But in many ways, the question becomes, what do we do after the meeting? And this becomes almost as critical, or I should say as critical, as the meeting itself. So what we're talking about here is a follow-up or maintenance stage following the meeting. And this has both an individual level component and a community component. At the individual level, the question becomes, how are we going to work with these B-listers? Again, I think in an ideal situation, you might have somebody like Linda Wright here in Indianapolis, or in Lansing, who's playing this kind of case manager role. She actually meets with all the clients, does a needs assessment, makes referrals, monitors whether they've followed up on these referrals, and some sites have been able to do that. In other places, those are simply services that aren't available, and part of this may be the organizational budget issue. And there, oftentimes, the information is provided that these services are available. Ideally, there's some effort right at the meeting, after the meeting, to try to connect the B-listers to these various service providers. And they're encouraged to take advantage of the services, but it's not a demand. It's not a requirement. And you'll have to figure out which of these models you're going to approach. So again, at the individual level, will you have a case management approach or not? And I don't think that a no answer to this means we don't do the call-in. It's a great benefit and add-on, but we've seen that the meetings have impact even without this component. Related to this issue is the accountability for those B-listers. So what are you going to do with them if they get in trouble? And what does trouble mean? Is it a dirty drug test? Is that going to bring down the full force of the law? Is it a new crime? Is it their participation or their failure to participate in services? And again, as you look across this wide range of jurisdictions that have used these call-in meetings, you'll find them kind of all over the place. In Flint, Michigan, again, where frankly their B-listers, they probably took some chances on people that a number of other communities would not have. And they're actually requiring those B-listers to participate in these services, or they consider it a violation and they're going to go out and issue the charges that they already have on these people. In other sites, and High Point would be an example, they don't require participation in any services. And what they're looking for is you remain crime-free, you don't become involved in violence, you don't become involved in drug dealing. And if you, on the other hand, if you do go in that direction, then they're going to do everything they can to arrest and prosecute. There's also an important community-level maintenance phase. And this can be thought of as really kind of a prevention follow-up. This may involve increased police presence. In the Nashville, Tennessee example, they had committed to having increased officers working 24/7 in this small target area, and they thought that they would have them there for a couple weeks. They found out after the first couple of days that the street-level violence and drug dealing had quieted down so much that they didn't even need to do this. At another extreme, Hempstead, New York, right outside New York City, They were dealing with a 50-year-old classic drug market associated with a public housing facility. And this had been the place to do your drug dealing for years and years, going back to the heroin epidemic. And they decided to have an increased police presence for about a year, which obviously has budgetary implications. So you'll have to think this through. We would recommend that you think about what's happening on the streets in your target area and having that drive this longer-term commitment to increase police presence. Another response in many communities is to make priority calls for some period of time within this particular area, so that even lower-level priority calls will get an immediate response from the police. And this is sending a message both to the people that may be offending within the neighborhood, but also your community partners, that things really have changed in terms of how the police are responding to crime problems within this neighborhood. Then another critical issue, and this gets to the credibility, is what are you going to do if the violence or whatever other type of crime activities are going to occur? And I'll use the landlord call-in meeting as an example. What if these landlords don't clean up their properties and they remain problems? Well, do you have an agreement with your code enforcement group to go out and actually do the inspections and bring these places into compliance? You know, that's what I would want to have in place if I was going to do one of those meetings. If you're talking about a group like the Taliban, let's say somebody does go out and they continue to be involved in violence, then, again, it's this idea of pulling levers. All the kind of things that you can do to communicate a message within that particular target area and with that particular group, you know, or both place-based and group-based kind of strategy. All the kind of levers that we can pull to send this message: listen, you were warned, the violence or other crime has continued, that's why we're here, we're going to do everything we can to get you off the streets until this violence stops. So this becomes a critical set of agreements among all your partners in terms of what are you willing to commit to after we do this call-in meeting. Then there's a community engagement part, and I think this gets to this momentum question, can we sustain this? And so it becomes absolutely critical as part of the community engagement. It didn't end with this meeting, but actually your community partners see that things are happening. Maybe it's a community cleanup, cleaning up the park, dealing with these problem properties, doing the code enforcement, you know, having a town hall meeting, we report back. This is something that High Point has done very successfully. So they'll go back on an annual basis in these target areas, and they'll report the crime stats from that particular area, and community members will talk about the improvements in the community, and there'll be this kind of celebration of success that can be you know, a critical part of maintaining that level of commitment. Questions about the follow-up and maintenance?
Ed, this is Iris. We got two questions.
Okay.
First question from Chet Epperson. He wanted you to discuss the social network analysis process. The second question was from Heather McCaffrey, and she wanted to know if any jurisdiction has used this for juvenile offenders. So it's social network analysis process, and has this been used for juvenile offenders?
Very good. Hi, Chief. And so Chief Epperson is certainly, he could have delivered this as well as me, but I guess he's got a question about social networks. The social network analysis typically consists of trying to bring together multiple sources of information that include, you know, the formal records of the police department, so incident reports, calls for service, field contact reports, along with street-level intelligence. I think it's ideal when you have probation parole partners. They bring the intelligence that they have. In some communities, they've broadened beyond criminal justice to include the schools, social services. You know, that kind of shared information can be complicated in terms of the kind of information that can be shared, but there are ways to make this happen. But to use all that information to try to identify these groups because when you can identify the groups, then you can maximize this notion of having an impact in the broader social network. And one of the interesting things, Chip mentioned the research we did in Indianapolis. So after a series of these meetings that occurred, we did interviews within the local jail. And one of the things that was so striking in those interviews is there was only about, it was like 2 or 3% of the people we interviewed had actually attended one of these meetings, but a very high proportion of the people in the jail had heard about the meetings, had heard about this message that was being delivered, and we thought that was very both kind of fascinating information, as well as kind of validation of the idea that these meetings can be used very effectively to try to influence these broader social networks. Yes, indeed, the meetings have occurred with juvenile offenders. This is an issue where thinking about the composition of the audience becomes absolutely critical. There are confidentiality issues related to juveniles that need to be worked through, but there are a number of communities that have had success holding these with juveniles, and I think can be part of a very effective strategy. So I think the issue here would be thinking through who can be part of these meetings, where you're going to have juveniles who have some protection, depending on your particular jurisdiction's laws governing juvenile records, but certainly it can be addressed.
And Ed, we have one more question from John Edwards. How effective have these meetings been in deterring domestic violence?
I am not aware that the meetings have yet been done in the domestic violence context. I've been part of a kind of a national conversation with people that have been asking, can we do this with domestic violence? There are a whole host of concerns in that context. Foremost of which is victim safety following the meeting. High Point is just about ready to implement this in a way, and so we're going to learn from their experience. But unless somebody else in the call is aware of something that I'm not aware of, I can't give you an answer. If I were in your seat, I think I'd wait about a month or two and contact Chief Faley and Deputy Chief Sumner and High Point, and the SBI team can certainly help make those connections and find out exactly how they're doing. Maybe this is the next webinar, is to learn from the High Point experience on the use of these meetings in the domestic violence context. So I will defer on that one. What I would like to do is, I've just got several slides left, but these are frequently asked questions that have come up in a variety of communities. So let me run through these quickly, but certainly if there are additional questions, let's address them. But I think some of the things that either you haven't thought about or maybe you haven't just posed the question might be anticipated here. And I do realize we're getting to the end of our time, so I'll try to be cognizant of that. One of the common questions that people ask when they hear about these calling meetings is, will these guys really show up? And the experience has been yes. And it's most effective when there's this hand delivery of that invitation. And in that context, we see 90 to 100% of these B-listers actually showing up at these meetings. Where there's only the mail,
you're going to be arrested.
Where there's simply the relying on the mail to deliver that meeting, they still show up, but there oftentimes you have many more non-attendees than when you can do the face-to-face. Chief Sumner and Chief Faley and Jim Summey, their community partner, all from High Point, and I were sitting around talking about these meetings at one point. We asked ourselves this question, and Marty Sumner said, they're just too curious. They have to know what we have on them, and he thinks that's the motivation of why they show up. So just like this curious, you might wonder why this curious cat would ever show up in this situation. This seems to be the situation with the call-in meeting. Another question, and I think this gets to the earlier question of you can get a bad reaction both within the meeting, and then I think the earlier question was, do you ever see a bad reaction after the meeting? And so one of the things that you need to be thinking about is how are you going to handle an unruly attendee during the actual meeting? And I think it's really critical here to set the ground rules of this meeting. This is not kind of a sit around in a circle, take your Birkenstocks off, and have a kind dialogue of all that's good or bad with the world. This is a one-way conversation. We have information to provide to you. And another part is to actually have somebody designated who's ready to escort somebody out that may be disruptive. And so think about this ahead of time. This is usually going to be somebody from law enforcement or maybe a probation or parole officer who may have jurisdiction over the individuals in attendance. But whoever's moderating the meeting has to be ready to say, it's time to get this person out of the meeting. They're not going to be allowed to disrupt the meeting. We talked a little bit about this question of who gets invited to the meeting and then who gets prosecuted, this distinction between the A list and the B list. Again, this is something you need to determine yourself. The key becomes, can you reach agreement on the criteria as well as the process? And one of the things that I would offer is, particularly for those cases that are kind of fallen in between the cracks of who's going to be prosecuted and who's going to be brought into this meeting, is you might ask yourself, well, what's likely to happen if this case does go to court? If it's going to be dismissed, if they're going to be put on super secret probation, maybe that's a good reason to bring them into a meeting. That may have more power than what would happen if they go to court anyway. The other thing that's interesting is to see kind of this ratio of A-listers to B-listers. Now, part of this is going to depend on the site. It's going to depend on the problem that you're dealing with and the group of people that you've identified. But the interesting thing is we see in some communities there'll be more people on the on the A list, so maybe 70% of these folks are going to get prosecuted and 30 we're going to bring into a meeting. In other places it might be a relatively equal split. In High Point, as I look at the data from High Point, they're actually inviting in a lot more people into the B list than they're having to prosecute. And they feel like they're using the prosecution selectively to have this broader influence. And I think the tendency is, with the more experience you have in doing these call-ins, there's a greater comfort level of dealing with these folks as B-listers. But again, I don't have a magic bullet on answering that question. You'll have to work that out yourself. I emphasized this earlier. I think this is absolutely critical, but you need to think through carefully what it is you're promising, both in terms of the threat of prosecution, what can you credibly do, as well as the promise of support. Don't promise these guys a job if you can't deliver. And also take into mind that many of these folks may not be ready for a job. They may need to be in a vocational training program that gets people ready for a job. And so think about language like, we will do our best. We'll do everything we can to get you off the street. We'll do everything we can to help you, but don't make a promise that you can't live up to. What do you call the B-listers? I never even thought about this until recently. This question was posed to me. And so I started asking people on different sites, how do you refer to these B-listers? And we got quite a range of responses, and what I think you'll see is there's kind of this balance between criminal justice system accountability and a message of respect for these individuals. And so here are some of the answers I got. Some of the places, straight, hey, these are offenders, these are dealers, these are defendants, that's why they're here. Some places use language like, you've been chosen, you're part of the notified group, clients, participants. And then at the other end of the extreme, some places have wanted to communicate this, I think, message of kind of a re-welcoming back into the community and use terminology like candidates for change, brothers and sisters. You'll have to figure out what you're comfortable with as a team. What type of security? For the majority of sites, they find that the heavy presence of law enforcement is enough to provide that kind of security. But several sites have said, we want to run people through a metal detector at these meetings. That may be a reason to hold this in a court setting. In Flint, they did this in a community setting, but they brought metal detectors there and had everybody walk through them. Again, an issue for you to consider. What are some of the problems? I've talked about these before. Staying on message, being respectful, being ready to have a disruptive attendee leave. You may have some people, if you're holding cases over their head, they may challenge the evidence. So having a prosecutor ready or somebody from the police department ready to say, this is what we've got on you. Any final questions that people might have?
Ed, this is Iris. We had, let's see, a question from John Edwards. Oh, no, we already went through that. I don't think we have any other questions that have come in. Let me ask to the group that's still on the phone and listening in. Any final questions for Ed today? No? In that case, I'd like to thank you, Ed,
Iris,
for this
let me do one more as a wrap.
Webinar. And I also want to remind everyone that this webinar has been recorded, and it's going to be uploaded to the SPI website. So I want to take an opportunity to thank everyone who also called in and participated in the webinar. If there are any other questions that you think of on offender notification, please feel free to pass it along to the SPI team, and we can follow up and get back to you. And again, check the website. We have additional resources, and we'll have this recorded webinar uploaded shortly. Finally, for folks that have called in for the webinar, you'll be getting a link that we ask that if you could please take a moment to fill out an evaluation form. BJA does look at these, so it's very useful to get the feedback. And I just want to thank everyone again. And Ed, really excellent webinar. Thanks again for taking the time, everyone.
You're welcome.
All right, have a great day.